Okay. Okay. We all understand that Shein is a pretty shitty corporation. It has a history of worker abuses. It has a history of a whole bunch of things like environmental regulation problems. But the only way to change this is to one, control who is actually in charge of the purse strings of Shein and also who and how we scrutinize the what goes on in the company. So our first point is on legibility. We think that by listing Shein on the London Public Exchange or whatever it's called, this creates more legibility for the issues that occur within Shein, and creates internal incentives to moderate. Why is this? I think what's different from status quo is currently there's not a ton of incentive for people to look very deeply into Shein's exploitative like processes in a way that is like very legitimate. So people have done things like journalists to interview people that work at Shein. And so you have people's records of saying like I work 75 hours a week, but you don't have really clear metrics. Like no regulatory body has gone in and explicitly proven on which sorts of sectors Shein is falling behind or what exactly they are doing, which is why all like the counter propaganda from Shein confuses people so much because people are really unclear the degree or the intensity of the harm that is happening to people there. So for every one worker that claims it's like 75 hours a week, China like promotes some other guy to say like we treat all our workers equally. There is no exploitation going on here. But what changes then is that when you do the listing, this forces some measure of accountability. The first reason is that when you do a public listing, the like exchange commission in the country of listing, in this case of London, has to go through or analyze how your company operates. So it's to analyze like what the profits per year are, but also how this money is distributed, i.e., how much money goes to the top CEOs and the basic minimum wages of their workers, which means then we have a much clearer photo of where exactly these exploitations are happening and what areas you like do this poorly on. This is likely to be quite effective because one, like London has pretty strict labor standards. There's the minimum wage, but also a huge cry from people internally to have some degree of accountability or to some degree of like good behavior from companies. But secondarily, they have a lot more resources and a lot more incentive to pursue these companies harshly than the Chinese government. So like the government in China has very little incentive to do things like scrutinize what Shein is doing or the ways it is fucking over its workers. There's also a high degree of government corruption. But in London, where the politics are relatively like less corrupt and more democratic, and you have more people such as like all the auditors or people to go through the minute details, it is likely to be more scrutinous and to be more accurate. But like thirdly, it's like they probably just like function quite well, right? Like they have to go through every sort of minute detail because there's a reputation that they have to uphold, which means that you have correct scrutiny on these areas. What is then likely to happen to Shein? First is that there's an internal desire to moderate. So when you list yourself on the public exchange, Shein is likely to do some sort of cost benefit trade off. Does it value the ability to list the company and to get all these sorts of investors, or does it like value the money it would lose by paying its workers more? They probably lean towards this listing because like the concessions you have to make like internally are rather minor, but there are more than you would otherwise like ever do. So you probably to satisfy the London Stock Exchange don't have to do things like pay your workers that much more or do that much better in terms of the environment, but you still have to do a significant amount more than you would currently be doing. We think that this marginal increase in your like good environmental practices or in the good distribution of capital is very meaningful for the people it happens to, even though because there would be like nothing else in the alternative. But the second is that like the Chinese company or like Shein is likely to be quite afraid of the harshness of Western regulatory agencies. They know that the West tends to be quite strict on things like labor abuses and that like they have a huge capacity to call them out when they're lying and to do things like good investigative like work, which means that like internally there's a drive to preemptively get ahead of the curve before they list themselves and to make sure capital is distributed a lot better. But the second point is on external accountability, where the people who buy these sorts of shares now maybe some of them are like vulture capitalists, but when you list the company publicly, that means anyone can buy them, which means all the public people, like all the like socially conscious public is able to buy shares of Shein. You probably want to do this because you want to get some form of additional capital or like savings and money into your retirement fund anyways. But we think that most of the public, especially people that are going to be buying these shares, primarily in Western countries, are quite socially conscious, which means that when you have reports that Shein is doing unfair practices or your money is directly tied to it, you one now have the information about on which areas they are failing because you've done this sort of investigative work, but you also have the capacity to make that change. You literally own shares of the company, which means that you can threaten to pull out or yeah, which means that you can threaten to pull out, and by doing so, like the price of their shares and their value drops, which Shein is likely to be quite afraid of. Before I go on closing,
Yeah, if you pay VAT or have goods that sell VAT in all like the UK, you still get regulated, you get audited. Like all of the stuff you're talking about here is symmetric to the status quo.
you pay VAT, but like there's no sort of like regulatory agency looking at how your profits are like distributed. What VAT looks at is like, have you paid your taxes? Probably Shein pays its taxes. It doesn't treat its workers well. This sort of scrutiny at the level of workers and at the level of specific sectors and your ability to identify problems comes when you go through public listings. But back onto the point about external accountability. So people will like buy these shares, but these same people are very accountable and want to do some sort of demonstrating to show that they are on the side of like environments and workers. The first reason is just like a growing wave of social consciousness. Everyone on social media is like saying that you should support workers and to like and to like what's it called, like go against environmental abuses, so you're likely to speak out about this sort of thing, but also that people are willing to take some sort of financial losses if it comes at the cost of like their purse strings because of the social desirability of this, which is why people are willing to make small sacrifices like losing money to donate to Gaza or Ukraine because they view it as so like socially valuable. I think like first, even if people are just threatening to do this and don't actually do action, which I think is at the level of most activism, the fear of your stock price dropping and the perceptual harms of this is so severe that this has some sort of impact on Shein. But the second is that like even if it's not a huge number of people pulling out, this is still a really tangible and financial harm that Shein feels that like is better than if it was controlled just by the CEOs at the top.
I thank the speaker for that speech. I'd like to welcome the Leader of Opposition.
Am I audible?
Yep, you are.
Okay, great. Let me just get my timer up. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Good. If we look at the current companies that are being traded on the London Stock Exchange as the FTSE 500 companies, you see Raytheon, which is a defense corporation that's literally selling bombs to Israel. You see Monsanto, which is literally starving farmers of their livelihoods. You see Nestle, which is literally flooding, causing cancer to people who live in developing countries. You see Exxon with massive oil spills. Notice that the vast majority of countries on the London Stock Exchange do a huge amount of evil in this world. Yet these companies are some of the biggest companies in the world. These are the companies that people use every day. They don't uniquely explain why suddenly, the moment that they go public, shareholder activism is suddenly going to control these companies. They don't explain why Shein is so much more egregious or so much more different from all these other 500 other companies that do so much evil in this world. I think that's a burden they have failed to do, and it's a burden they need to give in deputy. I think the several reasons why this argument about shareholder activism doesn't work on their side. Firstly, I think that this is ultimately a Chinese company that is held abroad. And this goes to the crux of our argument. But basically, it's much harder for you to do activism on a company that is being held abroad. It's much harder for you to access that company. But secondly, notice how IPOs are structured. Executives in those companies know that there's a risk of shareholder activism. They're advised by, that's why you pay large investment banks and large commercial lawyers like Goldman Sachs so much money when they do an IPO. They do do this because they're advised to be careful of shareholder activism. How do they prevent shareholder activism? They do it by doing things like golden shares, which mean that oftentimes, even if you invest a huge amount of money into the company, you don't get voting rights on the board. You're not able to actually influence what the board says or doesn't do. And so you're actually a huge amount of power is left with executives who have the interest in making profit and expanding the company. Thirdly, I think that oftentimes the people who tend to have the most money in the status quo aren't retail investors. They're not your mum like investing £500 into Shein, right? It is billion-dollar pension funds. It is billion-dollar institutional investors. Those people have a financial directive. They're there not for activism, but they're there to generate profit in the first place. They want money. Shein has a huge amount of growth potential, which means it's likely to be a very, very popular IPO. Lastly, I think that this is already something that is undergoing, like there's already a huge amount of boycotts of many of these companies like Starbucks because of the Israel-Palestine war. Notice that Shein is separate from that. Shein is not a company that is being boycotted. There's already a huge amount of media saturation that is already going on. It's going to be very difficult to get people to now direct themselves to also doing Shein when they're already focusing on Starbucks and McDonald's and all of those things. I don't get what they're talking about when they say, oh, there's going to be far more scrutiny of these companies, right? Notice what scrutiny on the London Stock Exchange looks like. The reason why companies like Monsanto and Raytheon and all these evil companies exist is because scrutiny is where you get like big four accountants to go and make sure you're not doing fraud and you're checking like the financial regulations. Notice that's what people want when they're investing in the London Stock Exchange. They want to make money. The reason these auditors are doing that is to ensure that your investment is safe. They're not there for some ethics. Like I don't see why a hedge fund or like a pension fund gives a shit about ethics. I also don't get how they have access to this information. They didn't explain why, if you're listed on the London Stock Exchange, when these sweatshops are being held in China, when they're being held in Vietnam, how an accountant or an auditor in London is going to somehow know about this happening in the first place. Why is our case then from opening opposition? It's extremely simple. First, I'm going to explain to you why the IPO is going to be super successful for Shein. I'm going to then explain why this money that Shein gets from this IPO leads to a mass out competition of Western companies, which are far easier to regulate on our side of the house and far more ethical. And therefore, we're able to minimize the harms on their side that they talk about whilst maximizing our benefits. So why is the IPO super successful for Shein? I think several reasons. Firstly, I think Shein just has a winning business model. It is a very growing retail market, and it's likely something that people want to be able to profit from, right? They have a huge amount of profit that they generate. There's something that a huge number of people use and buy from, and it provides a very, very good product and service for people, which means that it's likely to be a winning business model that many people are going to get on. But even more importantly, you create a huge capital inflow when you do an IPO and you open yourself up to anyone who wants to invest rather than a small select group of private investors. Notice that Shein is a Chinese company that is based in China, which means oftentimes Western investors and American investors are scared to invest in the company because they're scared about Chinese interference, or they're scared about, for example, the fact that this company is something that's operating far away and they don't know about it. The moment you put it on the London Stock Exchange and it has to follow the financial regulations and rules of London, it means they're far more trusting in investing their money into Shein in the first place, which means that these greedy people who want to generate a lot of money are going to be far more comfortable investing in a winning company like Shein when it's on the London Stock Exchange, which means you get a huge outpouring of institutional investment. That is people who are there and who have made their livings all their lives from making money on the stock exchange. You get the people who are investing in Boeing and Apple and all these other companies. Those are the people who are going to be now happy to part ways with their money and give it into Shein. Why is this so important? It's not just important because they get a huge capital inflow from this and a huge amount of cash being injected into the company. Most importantly is the currency differential. That is, Shein operates in China and Vietnam. They're able to access pound sterling. They're able to access US dollar. These are more powerful currencies, which means they get even more bang for their buck. What does this mean? It means that Shein can firstly pursue massive expansion, which means all the harms that OG talk about get far, far worse, because now they have shareholders giving them money and saying, I want returns, I want dividends. Shein is going to now massively expand its operations. This means opening new sweatshops. It means a huge capital injection. Loads of money gets pushed into that. We get more environmental damage, all those bad things. Secondly, Shein can better outcompete others. It now has a huge amount of free cash, which means it can buy other companies up. It can buy up Primark, it can buy up Uniqlo, it can buy up H&M to better establish itself in Western markets and expand further. Thus, you can do aggressive marketing. Why is this bad? It means that it's much harder for Western corporations to operate. Why are Western corporations operate? So that means more people end up buying from Chinese companies. Why is this harmful? Firstly, it's far easier to regulate Western corporations. That is, it's far easier to verify the information that you get from them because their headquarters are based in your own country. You're not going to be able to send PC Plum from London all the way to China and all the way to Nanjing to collect documents, but you sure as hell can raid the offices of Uniqlo or H&M because they're based in London and America. Secondly, there's far more transparency about how these firms operate. It's far easier for investigative journalists to investigate these companies. Thirdly, oftentimes the factories of these companies are based in Europe. They're based in the US. That means that oftentimes the workers that are in those companies face better worker rights. This means that structurally, and this is a structural reason because the US and EU want jobs in their own countries, which is why they give generous subsidies to these countries to set up their factories to their own companies to set up factories in their own countries. Notice China also puts tariffs on like their competitors so they don't go to China, they don't go abroad. What this means is that oftentimes these companies have better worker rights and better minimum wage laws and all of these things from them. So oftentimes this means that these people are looked after better. Lastly, because of the time, oftentimes these companies are protected by the EU and US. Those governments have better political capital to convince them to follow good rules and do good things. For all those reasons, very, very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for that speech. I'd like to welcome the DPM.
Cool. Am I audible?
Yep, you are.
Thank you. I'll start in a sec. Panel, the opening opposition case relies on a premise of Western grandeur and morality that simply does not exist and does not happen. I want to take them out before we rebuild our case, demonstrating why it's far more likely that you at least get some degree of meaningful change and betterment on our side of the house. I think firstly and crucially, their key premise is this idea that a lot of Western companies are a lot easier to regulate. First piece of framing here is the fact that Shein is already registered in London, i.e. it is already centralized in the West. The difference is that it simply offshores its businesses and sweatshops and manufacturing plants into countries like China that allow lower worker rights. The issue is, and this is crucially destructive for their case, this is not unique to Shein. This is not a revolutionary business model. This is something that every single Western company that they praise literally does. This is Primark's model, it's Zara's model, it's what every single company and corporation already does in the status quo. And they aren't being regulated and they aren't being changed as per their characterization. Therefore, this doesn't change. Having China simply be in the limelight now in the West doesn't matter insofar as it's already firstly based here and still suffers no change, but secondarily offshores into countries that do not have the same regulations and therefore aren't going to be liable to any degree of malleable change. The only way we actualize change is the metric that Emily gives you. That is to say, the way and transparency you unlock by uniquely going public. Secondarily, though, they try to really push this idea that you're going to have more investors and that people don't invest in general as we want them to. I want to be very clear. People already invest a lot into Shein and the status quo. They talk about fear of Chinese infiltration, but just simply isn't true. You operate on profitability, and when you see that that Shein has a profitable business model as they themselves characterize, that's when you opt in. We already operate in a highly globalized world whereby most people cross-invest across borders and countries and different economies. Therefore, this is something that is very much within the norm and something that's widely acceptable insofar as we chase profit. I want to be very clear. The margin is evident. We'd rather a situation whereby at least some percentage of Shein is going to be owned by a more conscious and a more self-aware audience rather than what is their world, i.e. a company that is solely operated by profit-seeking individuals who do not care about morals, who do not care about the exploitation and the damage they are causing to people's lives and to the environment in general. First piece of characterization is why actually a lot of people who do invest into this aren't as they characterize pension funds, but rather individuals. I think firstly, there's been a huge degree of accessibility change in regards to investing. That is to say, platforms such as Robinhood or just generally banking apps such as Revolut that enable you to invest directly have made it hugely more accessible for the average individual to partake in things such as investing, and made it more accessible and appealing insofar as they are aware that they need some degree of greater income to support themselves monetarily. All of this cumulatively means that there's a huge pool of young and moral investors that generally do want to buy up companies that do want to have some degree of influence. And I want to be very clear here. I think even if we actualize, say, 10% of these shares being owned by, for example, more conscious investors, this is enough to create some meaningful degree of change, some meaningful degree of blockage to the policies that otherwise would have a lot easier sway. I want to be very clear in rebuilding our case, because I think firstly, they severely underestimate the way in which Shein operates uniquely as a business and why it's so crucial. Firstly, it is not like the other companies they characterize and try to assimilate towards. That is to say, it is a company that specifically targets a young Western audience, i.e., they sell clothes that aim to be fashionable, to top trends, they try to ascertain TikTok virality, all of these things, and they target and posit themselves on a young, fashionable audience. The issue for them is the fact that this audience often overlaps with strong ethical morals and a more socially just environment that they want to posit and push into the world. That is to say, a lot of the youth that they would be targeting their clothes towards and their goods towards are often involved in social movements. They often align with things such as feminism that recognizes how the clothing and textile industry is particularly exploitative towards women. They are environmentally conscious because they've been raised to be more educated in regards to this and are aware of the pressing and looming threats, hence why they care about things such as damaging the environment and the pollution that these companies cause. They are aware of this, and Shein also is aware of the damaging implications that they have. This might be me like revealing myself as being clinically online, but Shein did a brand trip like a few months ago into their factories in China and posted it all over TikTok because they were trying to show this audience that they're so moral and actually the working conditions are really good and things are really great and you should buy. I think this demonstrates a number of things. I think one, it proves the point that oftentimes and frequently Shein is trying to buy into this young and conscious and moral audience, but secondarily that they are aware of the risks that come with the company not being supported by this moral public and by not aligning with this. With that in mind, what changes when you go public? I think firstly, there's a huge degree, as Emily tells you, of transparency and disclosure. That is to say, public companies are required legally to disclose financial and operational information that you otherwise just do not get when it's a private company. You have the Securities and Exchange Commission that enforces this and means that you get detailed financial statements from these regulatory bodies, for example, annual reports, quarterly reports. But it also goes deeper. You also get disclosure of management discussions and analysis that you simply do not have access to. This means that the self-regulation that Emily talks about is horrendously likely to occur because the information is incredibly damaging to the company, especially when it's selling to a highly moral audience. That is to say that they're aware of the profit loss due to social media backlash and cancel culture that incentivizes and pushes individuals to opt out of purchasing products such as Shein through things such as virtue signaling, from condemning individuals who are wearing it, through shaming them and actively condemning them through hate comments and all of these things, and telling you that you're a bad person if you do buy these, hence why a lot of people opt out. Secondarily, it's a lot easier to lobby these companies because they also disclose information of corporate governments and managements. That is to say, the specific chains of command and how the company operates makes it far easier for individuals and social justice movements to lobby these individuals because they're now in touch rather than simply blank figures and names that you cannot access otherwise. And thirdly, they know that the bad rep is damaging. The trade-off for these companies then becomes the fact that you know it's more profitable for you to make concessions. You know that even if you slightly increase the wages, it's a demonstration of progress. And note panel, this is crucial because even if an employee gets paid $1 more, this is a dollar that makes a huge difference to their lives. It improves what they can and cannot buy. It improves their living conditions substantially from the net zero that they have now. I think cumulatively, the self-regulation, which we prove on high likelihood, which is far more likely than the business model change that opening opposition posits, necessarily creates a great degree of regulation and a great degree of improvement, which is at least better on our side of the house, due to the things like social media backlash, due to things that you know you're going to lose once you're exposed to this. But secondarily, what Emily tells you, that is to say the internal management of the company now becomes more public. That is to say it's controlled to a greater degree of individuals who are moral, who have some degree of sway in this, which means both internally we unlock regulation, which preemptively happens to avoid backlash and to maximize profits, but also externally the people have more power and very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for that speech. I'd like to welcome the DLO to close up top half.
So guys, it's a bit of a fact claim, I guess, to say that Shein is a Chinese company. But the name is based on pinyin, which is a Chinese word. And sure, they're registered in London, but they are headquartered in China as a fact. They are being regulated by China in the status quo. Publicly listing them does not change the regulations on their supply chains. They are just wrong about this. Secondly, when they tell you that Zara and other companies are involved in fast fashion, yeah, that's true, but these companies are much more regulated than Shein. They miss our comparative, right? They cannot just assert that these companies are worse than Shein. We give you structural reasons for why Western leaders and Western countries are more likely to regulate and be able to regulate companies headquartered within their countries. And we gave you key comparatives for why this is true, because governments gave subsidies to these countries to set up factories in-house within their countries to ensure that they were able to reap the profits. And that was why it was much easier to keep these supply chains held to account. And these companies often did so because it gave them an advantage in shipping costs. Because who did they want to appeal to? The rich European markets who wanted these clothes really, really badly. And that is the comparative that they missed about why regulation will be much worse on their side. Finally, it seems like their big change in this debate is that you get more information, but I'd point out that they never proved to you as to why we need more information on Shein's malpractices. Like, all of us in this room seem to know it. There's journalisms, there's watchdogs, there's huge investigation covering this. What is it that we need about Shein's financial transparency that would make a big impact in the debate? The much clearer impact in this debate is the fact that they massively accelerate the horrific damage that Shein is doing to supply chains around the world, harming communities and making them worse off, staving off a better form of competition that is likely to be much more regulated. And I'm going to explain in the speech why that matters much more than questions of labor or job creation, given that that issue will be relatively symmetric in the debate. The first thing then that I'm going to look at is the issue of accountability, which opening government pushes. They basically say that shareholders are going to drive Shein to reform. My first response to this is to point out that most stockbrokers are not activists and will not pressure for such reforms, and Shein's business model will not change for three structural reasons. The first reason is exactly what Ahmed told you, which is that the vast majority of stockholders, the richest people, do not care about this. And in fact, Shein makes money by pricing their goods on the cheap. Like, this is their business model. It is what separates them from other people. And when a person invests in a stock, what they want back is their money. Fixing these issues would harm their bottom line. Therefore, there would never be pressure for this by the most large group of investors. Secondly, shareholder activism requires a huge amount of coordination that rarely occurs because so many people need to buy up stock in your company and coordinate to make and vote for the kinds of changes that you want to get anything on their side of the house. They never explain why that would actually occur. But thirdly, we preempt this. We explain that Shein is aware of this, and the board and the investors want to prevent this, so they are more likely to give golden shares and very tiny portions of the company to the people that they say are going to shake the boat so much. So what is the end of this mitigation? Well, it proves that maybe via shareholder activism, they get a very little bit amount of change via the very unlikely scenario that these people band together and vote for supply chain changes. But you have to weigh this up against the much more concrete harm that we know is happening, which is that Shein gets flooded with capital, expands their businesses, and is now prone to Chinese regulation. The second thing that I want to flip is the idea that Shein is not privy to the regulatory pressures that that competitors are, which would be empowered on our side of the house, which we further entrench. And the reason why is because Shein is currently able to outcompete Western producers by having such low prices. This boosts their ability to do so and prevents these producers from putting up a mounting competition against Shein where they would be better regulated. Let's then deal with what happens in terms of regulation. So they say basically London regulations are going to be imposed. The first thing that I want to point out is, yes, financial audits are imposed, but they are not privy to supply chain regulations. This is why some of the top 10 unethical companies are listed on the London Stock Exchange. London does not get to regulate companies based in China, especially companies which are listed and headquartered within China. Second of all, even if this regulation was legally possible, supply chains are just very hard to hold to account because these companies are often able to lobby the government to prevent them from looking into their operations, because supply chains have regulatory protections which governments have to ensure that people manufacture within these countries. It's much harder to track on their side of the house. So the best way to stop this is to slow down the production of bad companies, not to hope that London's regulations are going to work to stop the unethical practices of Shein. Finally, I would see that stock exchanges structurally tend to be lax on regulation upon entrance because they want more people to join the public exchange. This is why there's likely to be a worse regulatory environment on their side. And here's the flip. A much more direct way to get reform is via state regulation, which is easier on fast fashion companies on our side of the debate, rather and reducing the total amount of fast fashion production, which occurs far more on our side. But on their side, you speed up the ability of Shein to be under-regulated for two reasons. First, this measure makes it significantly harder to regulate Shein, given the huge advantage they will immediately gain in the flood of capital that they get. Meaning, it's much harder for them to pressure, it's much easier for them to pressure the government doing things like lobbying and corporate capture. They have so much money that they can use to rile up campaign ads and get people to stand against the regulations that they say. So regulation weakens on their side. But secondly, Shein is structurally prone to being under-regulated because they are prone to the Chinese regulatory environment as opposed to the London one, where we gave you structural incentives for why these Western companies are much more likely to regulate these supply chains within their own countries as opposed to China, who is much less concerned about this. So what does this mean for the debate? Basically, all of opening governments and government claims in this debate about expanding Shein's production and making them better gets flipped. And the reason why is because the pace of shareholder activism will never outmatch the pace of the harm done by the massive boom in production they suppose. Before I continue, I'll get CG. CG, OG.
Shein already sells clothes much more cheaply than the average fast fashion chain and has the backing of a significant number of angel investors. Its market share comes from the demand that comes from its price point. Why is IPO necessary for the harms that you talk about to accrue?
I'm sorry, I don't really think I understood the POI. I think we clearly explained that this gives Shein a lot of money to expand their businesses, stuff out competition, and as a result, we get worse regulated supply chains than would emerge on our side. Finally, on the issue of labor, basically, opening government kind of says, and closing government might say, that basically it's really good to have Shein expand because they're able to hire more workers, and they might do some weighing that's like, well, at the very least, we have this. A thing that I just want to say here is that this is symmetric on both sides. There's equal market demand for clothes. The question is, do we want mega fast companies like Shein based in China or more competitive market with safer supply chains and more regulations? So we get Uniqlo, we get Zara, we get these companies that are headquartered in Europe much more in the forms of production which occur. Labor is not the comparative in this debate, but they also need to explain to you why jobs matter more than the horrors that Shein is doing to people around the world in terms of environmental destruction, the smog that kills 80,000 people a year, the devastating impacts on the climate and the environment, and the working conditions that people are employed in, and the reduction in jobs overall due to the outcompeting effects that Shein has. This is why shareholder accountability doesn't cause reform. Stopping Shein does. I'm proud to oppose.
I thank that speaker for that speech. To all debaters for what was a lovely top half, I invite the member of government to open up back half.
Sorry, just give me a sec. I'm gonna try to set this up so it's less lame-o online debating. I'm gonna take my minute to try and move stuff around. Okay. Am I audible and visible? Do I need to speak louder? This is good.
Yeah, that's fine.
All right, great. And I can hear POIs. So please ask them in the chat, which I can also see, and I will take them. Okay. Top Half repeatedly insists on its own symmetry. On one hand, fast fashion companies like H&M and Zara that are already headquartered in the West do horrific labor practices in the same countries that Shein does. On the other hand, Shein is apparently going to be really bad for some reason that OO says it will be able to expand its operations. I'm going to talk about the purpose of an IPO. And I think that there are two basic purposes that an IPO can have, and that opening opposition has gotten the wrong one for this debate. One thing that an IPO can be is a liquidity event. That is to say, the people who initially invested into the company withdraw their capital because now they've sold it on to other people. So they get rich, they become billionaires, people get lots of money, there's lots of money that enters into Chinese domestic economy. The other kind of an IPO is one like where you need to inject capital into the company in the first place, where the company needs to raise money in order to grow, and it hasn't been able to do so or doesn't want to do so from private markets. Opening opposition seems to think it's the second one, that Shein is going to use this capital expansion in order to open more businesses and so on. But we would actually posit that this is largely a liquidity event for founders, employees, and early investors to take the money out and be compensated for the risks that they initially put in. Why is this structurally likely? Because the business of Shein doesn't have high upfront costs. It doesn't have to make billions of dollars of investments like a tech company. It is literally just selling ridiculously cheap clothes. It's using guerrilla marketing tactics like paying individual influencers. These weren't things that required large amounts of money that you needed to fund billions of dollars from an IPO for. And already Shein is incredibly prominent. It's not like we're talking about an IPO early in Shein's history. We're talking about it today, in which almost everyone already knew what this was before this debate. And I think moreover, it benefits from very cheap labor sources. The consequences of all of this is quite simply that it is unclear what the role of additional money is playing in Shein's operation. Why it needed an extra $10 bill to do more a business, I didn't know, and we didn't get that from opening opposition. We asked them in a POI, and they were just like, are you stupid? I don't fucking know. Okay, look, the marginal benefit of investment is not influential at all. What are the consequences then of this IPO? It has to do with a liquidity event. In the status quo, there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding the viability of liquidity events, particularly for Chinese business and Chinese entrepreneurships. Our argument is going to be that an overseas IPO of this standing in this public-facing position is good for Chinese business and leads to more expansion of Chinese business and the Chinese domestic market. Okay, so in the status quo, there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding the viability of liquidity events for Chinese investors for two reasons. The first one is that domestic Chinese markets are particularly weak. That is to say that China's economic growth has been slowing down. It has been withdrawing the degree of investment that the CCP engages in the economy. But moreover, there's a lot of uncertainty about how much Chinese businesses are going to be able to operate overseas because of geopolitical uncertainty, because of the risk, for instance, of an invasion and so forth. And this is especially true for companies selling to Western consumers like Shein does. That's a shared premise with opening opposition. OO says the same thing. We think it has profound implications in this round. Shein is a huge IPO. The whole world, and especially Chinese investors and entrepreneurs, will be watching this closely. And when it actually happens on the London Stock Exchange, they will see that there is still a room for Chinese business, that there is still a room for them to make the money that they get after they are successful. What are the consequences then of this IPO? The consequence is reassurance. It means that people are more likely to start businesses, particularly those that export Chinese goods overseas. It means they're more likely to invest in businesses knowing that they will actually get benefits from that and you'll be able to make cash money from their returns. That's especially important for exports to wealthier countries. And also quite directly, the liquidity event will inject a bit of capital into other Chinese businesses because the money will flow from Western investors into China. The rest of this debate will deal with an absurd claim that opening opposition makes and basically just flip the argument. Opening opposition asserts that Shein is going to use this money to outcompete the West, and the West is going to be better behaved. So basically, it's an argument against Chinese business. And we're going to say that Chinese business is on net good. And even though the effect of the dollars on Shein itself is probably very small or negligible, as I've already pointed out, I don't think this debate changes their operations to any significant extent. We do think that an increase in Chinese business overall is going to be very good, and they might insinuate that it's bad. So I have to give you 4 reasons as to why Chinese business is robustly good. The first one is employment. We're going to bite the bullet and say that we're going to employ people in the developing world. We're probably going to employ people in sweatshops. This is a net positive for the world. People cross borders illegally from Guatemala into Mexico because they want to work in Mexican sweatshops, because the counterfactual is literally starvation and deprivation of material resources. Chinese companies, as per the admission of opening opposition, are more likely to employ people in China and Southeast Asia more frequently, not just in the sweatshops, but also in white-collar positions, because that is the domestic market in which you are based. DLO says that it is symmetric because on either side, someone in America has a job or someone in Vietnam has a job. No, it is not symmetric because the marginal utility of money, as for the average Vietnamese person versus the average American, is dramatically different. When you pay someone the minimum wage, it actually gives them a lot of economic flexibility, ability to invest in their children's school fees and so on in Vietnam in a way that it does not do in America. As a consequence of this, we think it is super important that we get employment into the most deprived areas in the world, and this is something that increased levels of Chinese business are likely to do. Again, it's not about Shein in particular, it's about the reassurance that this has as a signaling effect onto the broader Chinese market. The second thing that's good about Chinese business is simply that it increases the level of wealth and income for the average Chinese person. And that's really important because there are 1.3 billion people in China. When you have less entrepreneurship, investment, and business activity as a consequence of a shrinking domestic market and a very perceived to be hostile foreign market, the consequence is that the economy itself shrinks, that there's more poverty, that there's more deprivation in that entire region, including in neighboring countries that are often much, much poorer than China. The third thing, I think, is simply that you reduce the degree of control that the CCP has over its own entrepreneurs. On the opposition side, without a Western IPO, companies are required to rely on the CCP to allow them to list domestically in China or to directly acquire or invest in their companies and subsidize them further. On our side of the house, there is a lesser role for the CCP in particular to play in the Chinese economy and more of a role of foreign investment. We think this is especially good because it decreases the political stranglehold that the CCP has over China right now. The fourth thing is I think you simply get more R&D because right now China is a world leader in things like green batteries and so on. When you have more export businesses that are designed to get green batteries into the hands of the West and you have the ability to IPO in the West, I think you actually get way more green tech as a consequence of this. And I'm not saying that this single IPO will solve all of these problems, but I do think the fact that Shein is a huge consumer-facing company that will be on the Bloomberg terminals of every investor on the world when it goes public does have an increased level of business activity as an effect. So overall then, the case is simple. We get more Chinese business. It is robustly good for the world. Deon and I are very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for that speech. I'd like to welcome a member of opposition.
Okay, I did two things with my time. One is public affairs, that's my job, so I know quite a lot about lobbying. And my other one is running Euros, so I know quite a lot about UK government regulation and how it works and how it's really annoying and quite tedious, which is bad for me, but probably quite good for people that don't like companies like Shein. Firstly, just meeting two quite basic burdens, then talking about how the entrenchment of Shein in Western markets is significantly increasing the amount of capacity that they have to influence regulation negatively and the deleterious effect that has overall to the clothing market in the largest consumer markets in the world. Firstly, basic burdens. Why does this actually increase the amount of Western investors you get, which is something weirdly that's not been touched in the debate? Really trivially, the reason that the London Stock Exchange increases the amount of Western investors these companies get is just time zones. They trade, I think, 9 to 5 in the UK, which means it's incredibly difficult for other companies that don't operate on Western time zones to be able to trade at this times. Otherwise, they would be working through the entire night, which most people don't do. And because you need to react to things in the market, that's very hard for people to do. Again, kind of trivial, but true. Most of this requires that a lot of the documentation that they need to do, mergers and acquisitions, etc., would have to be in English, which then therefore means that the people that engage with it are just the English-speaking markets. As a result, this broadly means this is a large influx of Western, investors coming into this, etc. Secondly, on consumer regulation, why does this actually do some things on consumer regulation, and how do we get there? And to what extent does the UK, the EU, etc., have the capacity to regulate Shein? Firstly, as our opening have already said, they do also have factories in Eastern Europe and other parts of America. They do also have supply areas. They do have large shipping or organizations in terms of transporting goods, warehouses, etc., that are subject to regulation from them, that are directly regulated by these governments. So they're not just directly subject to Chinese regulation. Secondly, at the point of sale, there is a bunch of regulation in these countries too. You need to meet certain environmental standards if you're selling a good in any of these countries, which is something that you get regulated by broadly as a result of this. Also, the same thing that there is regulations on human rights abuses and products that you're selling in any countries. So these are all once again subject to regulations, and if they fail to meet this, then they would literally just be not allowed to sell these goods in the EU, the UK, the US, etc. I also just think, thirdly, regulation broadly here has a market effect broadly on all other standards for all other clothing sellers, retailers in the market. How does this significantly increase Shein's lobbying power, and why does that mean that the regulation that you would get on the clothing market is going to be significantly worse? And I just want to note here that really the only meaningful way that you're actually going to get change is regulation. I mean, Parth can go into more on why the OG stuff doesn't work. But yeah, just broadly, I think given that the market has kind of resolved to say that Shein is the largest, fastest growing, most profitable clothing company that exists currently, it's reasonable to say that just believing people will do good things doesn't quite work. And what we actually just need is governments to step in to stop the more active harms. How does this work? How does their influence increase? Why is that likely to be very, very bad? The first thing is, at the point at which they are an IPO, they are sold, they have a significant amount of Western investors backing into them. This increases the amount of availability that they have and just access and connections and mutual investment to the largest investors in these countries, and also just things like the hedge funds that they run, the people and the social networks and the circles that they work in. The way that lobbying works in most instances is just networks of trust. Currently in the status quo, Shein is effectively outside of these networks of trust. At the point at which they are heavily financially invested and Western companies, organizations are heavily financially invested back into Shein, then they are suddenly in these networks of trust. They are then able to develop these connections. They're then able to develop the kind of contacts, communication, like PR work directly into the political system. At the point at which you're traded on the LSE, you are effectively infiltrated into the kind of British Western establishment to a significant extent. Comparatively, you're far, far more likely to be on the outside. What this literally looks like is just your ability to do things like talk to politicians about issues. You're able to say what you're doing, why it's good. You're able to suggest things in regulation. You're able to maintain relationships. You're able to say, oh, here are all the reasons why in your constituency or region or whatever, this would actually be really, really economically bad for you to be able to do this. Maintaining this relationship also means that you get other further existing networks. This looks like, in the most extreme example, literally just like members of parliament who are also people that are invested and can be on the board of the hedge fund that is also invested into Shein and has a personal financial interest in effectively stopping any regulation from happening to them. This is also just noting not just something that exists in the UK at the point at which you're really infiltrated into Western markets. This similarly exists in the EU and this similarly exists in America. The second reason that this is very likely to happen is just literally scale. At the point at which they are able to be largely invested into Western markets, there is a significant amount of money that people stand to lose from this, and there's evidence that they can give for the amount of money that they're going to lose for this. This therefore means that they're going to just kind of organically, because of the risk to other people that are exposed from this, develop secondary, tertiary lobbyists who will be advocating on their behalf, even if they're not literally doing this themselves, but advocating on their behalf and advocating on behalf of the industry to block any regulation that would be harmful to them. I think what this literally just looks like is things like they want to do some environmental regulation, and there is a huge army of people that come to politicians, give intense pressure. They go to the journalists that they're friends with. They go to the organizations that are clientele effectively to them and are able to arrange massive PR campaigns to literally block this highly, highly more effectively than previously. I'll take the POI from OG.
Yeah, if people have no reason to just do things, what reason does London have to sanction China if it's not connected in any way through the London Stock Exchange?
China and Shein are not the same thing. I think, as I said at the start of this, the regulation that they are able to say is, yeah, literally just the things that they're able to block them from doing within their own borders at the point of sale, etc. I also think they can do things like impose tariffs, for example, which work relatively well here. I think this is kind of like an unnuanced version of the way that this works in the real world. Companies, these are the largest consumer markets in the world. They would basically cease to be able to function well as companies, Shein, if they weren't able to do this. They have significant amount of regulatory power over them. What does this actually, lastly, just very quickly, going on to regulation. When you have to pay tax in countries, you need to do a bunch of very specific stuff in terms of understanding what type of company that you are. So this looks like just what things you're exempt for based on things that happen across the supply chain process, what countries that you work in, etc. This largely means that you need to be audited. You need to be very, very clear on where exactly your profit and loss comes from. This literally looks at things as simple as what workers are you actually paying in certain countries to be able to get certain exemptions, for example. What this means then is regulation is basically the same on both sides of the house in terms of visibility, but in terms of actual capacity to do things, it's greater on our side. All these reasons oppose.
I thank the speaker for that speech. I'd like to welcome the government whip to close up Gov Bench.
honestly. I don't mind.
Yeah, cool. So Tanae retroactively consents to recording. And I suppose I do too. POS in the chat, please. All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'll deal with OO and show why Tanae's contributions take them out. Then I'll deal with CO and then OG. OO's case is contingent on an IPO being the tipping point for massive expansion of Shein. The first response here is that the tipping point is actually their market share and the sheer number of fucking clothes they can sell. They have a product. So if you can sell clothes more cheaply, the demand that comes from this price point means that you're always going to be extremely large with or without an IPO. They have the backing of angel investors that know that expansion is the way to ensure an eventual liquid ROI in the first place. And we know this was a lot of private companies have had the ability to expand for ages. Think, for instance, ByteDance, Revolut, Epic, all private companies with massive ability to expand anyway. So for me to believe OO, I must first believe that an IPO gives Shein access to expansion that they weren't already planning to do. I agree that an IPO may give Shein more liquidity, but it's really unclear how much more liquidity you need when your assets rival that of a small country. But second, as Tanae points out, in fact, sometimes an IPO doesn't result in more market value. Sometimes it means that the asset is like the asset is actually priced lower than you thought it was, especially if, as you have like Shein, a fuck ton of angel investors waiting to cash out liquidity for their initial investments to begin with, which tends to lower the asset price and lower the stock price at the start of the IPO. So think, for instance, when Facebook created the IPO in 2009, when I was still a teenager, right? And in the end, for the first 2 years, their stock market price crashed for 2 years. It is very unclear that the IPO results in the expansion that they talk about to begin with. So OO is already out of this debate because they don't understand basic economics. But the next response is OO is contingent on a need for extra competition to happen with fast fashion. Because if I can prove that competition doesn't matter, then none of their impacts from this expansion necessarily accrue. Look, Nike has had their IPO in the 1980s. They still fucking let child workers starve in China. Why? Because labor standards don't apply overseas to begin with, and because cheaper goods to the public matters the most. I like my cheap clothes. Unfortunately, the suffering of people in China doesn't matter much to me compared to my 10% increase in the cost of living. OO says, but when Zara is headquartered in the US, that will make a massive difference. And the reason why they'll be headquartered is because of shipping costs. Are you fucking kidding me? The difference between paying a textile worker in India versus America is literally in the like exponential range, right? And all concedes this when they talk about currency disparity is precisely the currency disparity that results in this huge disparity in the amount you need to pay workers to begin with. That definitely covers the shipping costs from shipping from China or India to America, which is why all of these fucking fast fashion companies already use and utilize lax textile standards overseas in order to do this. It is unclear why Shein is any worse or any better than Zara or Nike or Uniqlo. But also, I want to point out that maybe you think that competition is just good. Like, you just want more competition, it's just a good thing. If that is the case, competition does exist. Like, Shein is large, but it's not so prohibitively large that it's drowning out Zara or HWN. Why do you need to protect Zara versus letting like competition organically happen, allowing Zara to make better clothes, find a niche in the market, etc.? There's no structural reason why Zara is unable to compete, especially when they are long existing brands with a fuck ton of brand recognition, loyalty, and goodwill that already exists in the status quo. So OO is solving a non-existent problem. So OO, what do you have to say?
Yeah, you miss our comparative. Sure, we lose Chinese jobs, but we empower Western companies to better regulate, to expand and give better jobs in countries like Vietnam that you care about, as well as better protect the environment and people's health.
No. When they go to Vietnam, they do the exact same thing to the Vietnamese workers anyway. So like at best, this is incredibly like symmetrical. Okay, CEO says, look, but lobbying very important. I would say they overstate the importance of and influence of lobbying. The problem here is that for lobbying to work, there must be very little opposing pressure against governments. The first thing I'll point out is that there are plenty of opposing pressures for the reasons that they talk about and OG talks about. But second, especially in Western countries, lobbying doesn't usually work because of the fact that the EU especially and the US cares about consumer welfare. So like if lobbying really worked to the extent that CEO claims, like Apple will be absolutely fucked, right? They wouldn't need to they'll be very happy. They wouldn't need to change their ports to the USB-C port. The reason why they had to was because often you're able to resist lobbying when there's something else at stake. So insofar as we can agree that lobbying might occur, it's unclear the value of this lobbying in terms of changing regulation for the worse, insofar as these countries already have opposing pressures against them. But second, again, what's the marginal value of the extra lobbying that will happen? Shein has a fuck ton of money already. If you're lobbying with the capital of a small country versus lobbying through a proxy and a secondary proxy and a tertiary proxy, what's the difference? There's no fundamental difference that CEO can give to me between what Shein is already able to do, given the demand for their clothes in the Western market, versus what they'll be able to do now with Western investors. Come on, guys. So I think the last thing I want to point out here is just a comparative weighing exercise. Why is it that we want more Chinese businesses and more expansion of Chinese businesses and Chinese domestic market, i.e. Tanae's material? Look, you might hate sweatshop work, but A, Nike does it too, and B, as Tanae tells you, having a job is good. But crucially, this solves a massive existing problem in the Chinese market. That means that people don't get jobs. First, they talk about investors and time zones. Yeah, that's the whole fucking point. Now you get more Western investors in the Chinese market because in Chinese companies, because they think that they'll get a return on investment in London Stock Exchange or in the Dow Jones or in the S&P. All that's a good thing. But second, now there's extra trust that your Chinese startups will result in liquidity events instead of going the way of Alibaba, where they're ultimately taken over by the state effectively. Now there is at least an assurance for Western investors that their money will result in a liquidity event in the future. That means that Chinese businesses expand. That means more jobs for Chinese workers. Why is this important? For all the reasons that Tanae already brings to you, but also because we ultimately reduce the degree of control that the CCP has over entrepreneurs. We think that's ultimately a good thing insofar as it means that more people follow the sort of Western standards that CEO and OO both want to impose in the first place. Finally, how does this weigh up against OG? It's evident from all other teams that bodies don't have as much power as they claim. CEO and OO both point this out. Therefore, the scrutiny of workers in China is not the problem of the UK regulatory body. Checks and balances are unfortunately relatively symmetric and marginal, even though we agree that what OG is saying is true, because media pressure already exists on both sides, investigative journalism exists, and also boycotts exist. So the same people who are liberal may not buy shares anymore and may not have a share, but they can still fucking boycott the product and have the same ultimate impact. So there is a marginal value to OG's arguments versus the certain outcome that Tanae brings to you in his analysis. Ultimately, I think CG comprehensively takes this debate.
I thank the speaker for that speech. I'd like to welcome the opposition whip to close up the debate.
Am I audible?
Yep, you are.
I'll take a POI from opening government. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let me give a key piece of framing which questions the rebuttal and pushback that we got from closing government. Because the most unique mechanism that Joseph provided, which is most important in this debate, is that there are Western political incentives, but then when Western investors are likely to invest and flood these companies, it's very, very hard for Western politicians to be able to do the things that they want to do, and that is the most important thing. For example, a piece of just framing, Amazon, the AOB just knows, resists massive attempts of unionization, stops their workers from unionizing, and it gives them 5-minute lunch breaks because they have Western backers and they have Western investors in those companies. So Western politicians cannot disagree with them because the amount of market share they hold and the amount of importance they hold to the economies of those Western countries, which is they can't disagree. Whereas the comparative, which I'll outline in a second, about doing things like protections measures and tariffs that Joseph outlined, is way more successful than the comparative. Let me first do some point out a bit of strategic commentary, which I think is really, really important. The first thing is to marginalize the government impacts from opening government, which is that Joseph has given you comprehensive framing not present in opening opposition about why through tax regulations and VAT and things like that, you need to do financial reporting anyway. You need to be transparent about the way your goods have been made to go through custom checks and things like that. For example, the UK doesn't accept, the America does not accept the chicken that the US makes in the UK because there are certain ways they make it and they can only do that through having that information in the first place. Therefore, key actors already have information, i.e. the investors and stuff, but the socially conscious people who would not even make up 0.0001% of that stock don't need to know about it because they're already acting upon it. So what is really important? Well, first of all, the Western mood, generally in the status quo, is tending to be anti-Chinese against companies. We see this through AI regulations that Joe Biden has put in, but also massive amounts of tech regulation. We saw from round 3, the reason why this is round 2, the reason why this is important is because China manufactures dirty and bad electric vehicles based on like massive amounts of pollutants in the first place, so they're actually bad quality products, or the influence that the loads of tech companies could have in the production of AI products in the first place. So the most important thing in responding to the CG pushback about the influence of lobbying is that you need your own Western investors to stay on side with you and your Western policies for you to be able to push against bad companies and bad actors in the first place. But what is the important thing now weighing its opening opposition? OO just says, well, now you can buy out Zara. They just say, oh, well, now Western investors flood it and therefore it is able to expand. But it's not the biggest harm in this debate. The biggest harm is, one, if they're able to buy them out, as Joseph said, then the clothing market regulation reduces. So Zara is already making changes to reduce its fast fashion because of the Western influences that opening government talks about, which is why there are actual changes being made in the status quo towards that. You scupper all of that progress now because there is a massive 50 billion floating value in the London Stock Exchange because Shein is very, very massive, very, very wealthy in the first place. So the clothing market regulations therefore go down. But the second thing is, and this is the most important contribution, because DLO says, oh, well, you can't do supply chain regulations. We agree with that on government side, but they don't offer how you're able to at least curb the influence of Shein in the first place. What we prove is that through protection measures and tariffs and things like that, Western companies are therefore able to, like, with the Western company shift like Zara, they are now pushing towards like not offshoring and more inshoring, which means that the Western governments and Western investors feel more confident and comfortable to put tariffs on like massive outsourcing and big supply chain and shipping routes in the first place, which means that they're more comfortable in doing that as well. But then Deon says, oh, well, what's the difference now? Well, the difference is the USP that closing government outlines of Shein is that their scale is so big that what we would say that any supply chain shock is massive on the amount it impacts Shein, right? Because of the Western Joseph said that there are loads of factories and warehouses of Shein in Eastern Europe and in America and things like that. There are massive supply chains. So if we're able to tax and import control and export control certain warehouses, that disrupts the supply chain. And due to the interconnectedness of the economy and relying on multiple actors, that is likely to produce like more investor flight in Shein, which is much better. And that is a better harm analysis than opening opposition does. And therefore we're beating on them in the first place. So I think that is why we beat them. Let's respond to closing government. The first thing is just a general observation about closing government. At the top of the extension, there was just an assertion that this is likely to be a liquidity event. They don't actually prove why they want to, like early investors want to sell off their shares or things like that. And I don't think they ever meet their burden. We prove that these investors probably want influence, and we have more mechanistic certainty that they do because they want to influence these markets and have an upper hand in being able to control them, which is why they would not want to cash in the first place, therefore flipping the claim from closing government. But also, we know that Xi Jinping has done massive tech regulation. Xi Jinping stopped Ant Group's IPO from going public, and they have massive amounts of power as a CCP to be able to do this. And this is bad because it impacts all of the uncertainty stuff that closing government is trying to say that goes down. It actually goes up because there's no more control and Chinese influence, as Joseph has also mechanized. So uncertainty therefore becomes a bad thing. Clothing government want to say that we have a margin problem, but they also have a margin problem. If they're already so big and they have massive amounts of employment and they have massive amounts of clothing market control, they need to prove why the wealth and income of 1.3 billion people would increase to a sizable effect that should be weighed off all of the harms that are likely to produce from those workers. OG's POI, go.
The EU already has jurisdiction over factories in the EU. If the good laws member talks about exist, they have to be enforced irregardless of status on the LSE.
This is important. This is a comparative game. We would prefer them to do this and continue to do this than to do the government stuff of actually integrating them to lobbying channels. And that is a comparative push that we're trying to make. So I think if she's already so big, they don't actually contextualize the wealth and income increase in the first place. but we proved that subtle changes in regulation are likely to be bad in the first place. But also then in terms of employment, this is their business model. They can hire people in Vietnam and et cetera, if they want to, and build up more factories because of the liquidity and the high, they don't have high startup costs, as CG says. So CG has very little comparative in the first place. Against opening government, I think Joseph's largely responded to this in their speech, but I want to just give one other piece of analysis, responsiveness. Their internal incentives to moderate, as not responded to by open opposition, do not happen because they have to be forced to do that. They can already do financial statements and reporting, and that's fine. But the ability for them to moderate, i.e. change the things that they do, can only come through external lenses, which is why you need closing opposition's analysis to be able to win this debate. Look, we might not, I think we don't have, like, I think the regulation stuff is the most important thing because it affects other things. Anyway, sorry, I've run out of time anyway. But anyway, for all those reasons, I'm happy to oppose. Thank you.